Okay, so we have the next session, which is supply network management. So an important subject, tapping into the stuff which would have been covered by Joe Sanderson in year one, building upon that and focusing particularly on the operational implications of supply chains and supply networks. So here's some questions for you to think about. Why should an organisation take a supply network perspective? What is involved in managing supply networks? What is involved in designing supply networks? What are the types of relationships between operations in supply networks? And what is the natural dynamic of a supply network? Okay, so there's Slack's transformation model, inputs, outputs, transform to transform resources, something going on in the middle. And that middle section, the transformation process, where we are now is we're still in the deliver section. So if you look at our little Venn diagram here, we've looked at capacity management, inventory management, touched on lean planning, lean synchronization, and tried to tie this all together with planning control. So those are the four bottom sections there. The top section, supply network management, brings all these concepts, particularly capacity and inventory management, to the fore, but considers them through a supply network. Okay, so we'll start with, now I've changed the word here, supply chain management. Now in, I guess, normal discourse, most people, most educated people will recognise the concept or the idea of a supply chain. It's a chain of organisations, one linked to the other, who supply components or services which take them through from creation, the initial creation point, right through to the consumer using them. So we talk about a supply chain, a supply network. I'll come on to what we mean by, or come on to the distinction between supply chains and supply networks. The distinction is really fairly arbitrary in many respects. It's about the nature of supply chains, but we'll come on to that in a bit. Suffice to say now that you can pretty much use the term supply chain and supply network interchangeably, and both are understood. Okay, so the simple definition here is that the supply chain is the facilities, functions and activities for producing and delivering a product or service from supplier to customer. Okay, so it's a chain of activities which involve organisations, and those organisations have facilities, they have functions, and they carry out activities, and these will involve producing and delivering services and products. Okay, the wider definition is one that very, very broad definition, which takes in raw materials at one end and delivers to the consumer at the other end. So everything from raw materials being taken out of the ground or recycled from waste, all the way through to the final consumer. Okay, so here's a typical way of thinking about a supply chain. We have a flow between processes and operations one, so various activities within an organisation or within an operation as part of an organisation, it could be. Then the next one is operation 2 is again a series of processes and value being created through the transformation process, and then operation 3 the same, and finally the consumer, whoever that might be, avails themselves of the service or product. Now, the way I think about a supply chain or supply network is backwards and forwards. So we use the analogy of a river. So we've got two analogies here: a chain, or a series of interlinked links, and the river, upstream and downstream. So downstream is going towards the consumer, upstream is going towards the source of the product or service. So upstream, the flow is of these things like long-term plans and requirements, market research information, individual orders from specific consumers or customers, payment for products and services used, and information about potential new products and services. So there's a lot of information, a lot of data flowing upstream towards the source. So from operation 3 to 2, 2 to 1, and so forth. And then to continue that analogy, we have downstream flow of products and services to the customer. Okay, so we have products and services themselves, new products and services, deliver information, payment requests, and possibly credit. And so these are going downstream towards the customer. So upstream, information flows, and that flow indicates the requirements of the customer. Downstream, we have fulfillment of those requirements, and that's downstream to the customer. So in this analogy, the consumer is the customer for operation 3. Operation 3 is the customer for operation 2, who's a supplier to operation 3. Operation 2 is the customer for operation 1, who's a supplier to operation 2. Okay. So what are the main principles behind supply chain or supply network management? The main issues are businesses have to manage flows of material information across supply chain networks. So I've used both words together there, supply chain and supply network, because it's a network of chains, really. Okay, so businesses manage the flow of materials and information. So this concept of flow is important. There are internal and external forces acting upon the operations. Supplier relationships need to be designed with a purpose, and that is to improve efficiency and improve innovation. So efficiency is about reductions in costs, delivery of better value, and innovation is about new products and services which are continually being developed. Okay, so here's some terminology. I've already used this concept of the river analogy, upstream and downstream. Now, some of the language which you might come across when you discuss or in discussion about supply chains and supply networks are tiers. We have first tier suppliers, second tier suppliers, and so forth. And first tier customers, second tier customers, and so forth. So you talk about the first level of suppliers, then the next level of suppliers, and so forth, all the way along, your second, third, fourth, fifth, whatever tiers of suppliers. Now at the bottom there you can see we have a number of words which again you may be familiar with. So we have purchasing and supply. So the customer purchases materials or services, or products or services from their suppliers, the first tier suppliers, and then those suppliers supply them, and that is inbound logistics. There's an inbound logistics element to that, which is the transport of, in particular, components and products to the customer. Upstream, we have physical distribution. So the organisation will distribute products and components to their customers. And we have outbound logistics. The whole thing is wrapped up in this concept of supply chain management. So all the tiers of suppliers, from the consumer all the way down through to the source, is supply chain management. Okay, I've got a couple of examples here of what we mean by a supply network. So this is a manufacturer. Okay, plastic homeware manufacturer. It could be anything, doesn't matter what it is. And at the bottom you'll see the purple lines or purple arrows are direct supply, and the red arrows are information transfer. So the plastic manufacturer will have its first two suppliers, who could be the plastic providers and packaging, because of course the final products need to be packaged and before they're transported. Now the plastic stockist, well, where does plastic come from? It's produced from chemicals. So chemical companies will provide the chemicals required to produce plastic for the plastic stockist. Okay, packaging requires things like ink, cardboard, whatever, and so in this example packaging has a couple of suppliers there who are second tier suppliers. Okay, so in each of these cases materials are flowing downstream from second tier to first tier to the operation we're interested in, the plastic homeware manufacturer, and information is flowing upstream from the manufacturer to its first tier suppliers, from its first tier suppliers to its second tier suppliers, and so forth. The manufacturer we're interested in has customers. The first tier customer might be a wholesaler, so it produces its products and sends it to a wholesaler who will then sell it on to retailers or whomever. And the retailer will be a second tier supplier, or the manufacturer may supply the retailer directly, or it may have a first tier customer who's a wholesaler and a second tier customer who's a retailer, and have different arrangements with each. So the wholesaler may supply a large number of smaller retailers, then there might be a major retailer such as a supermarket chain or something like that, and the manufacturer might supply them directly and have a direct agreement with them for supply. So suddenly we're into a slightly more complex network as opposed to a simple straightforward chain. Okay. Now, something that is important to bear in mind, this applies to services as much as it does to production of products and components. So the first example I just showed you was about a product. Okay. Now this next example is a supply network providing services. So the example I have here is a shopping mall. Think the Wallring in the middle of Birmingham, or any other major shopping centre or shopping mall you're familiar with. Okay, so the shopping mall is a centre. It has, again, suppliers and customers. So sort of things that might be supplied to the shopping mall, which it wouldn't necessarily provide itself. So it wouldn't employ these services itself. It would procure them from first tier suppliers. Things like security services. Okay, the shopping mall is not about providing security; it's about providing a space in which retailers can occupy. So it could well, and probably does, buy in security services and cleaning services and maintenance services to fix things when they go wrong. So the first tier suppliers would be those sort of organisations. They're all providing services to the shopping mall. Second tier suppliers. So the security services need people to provide that security service, and they might get this from a recruitment agency. Cleaning services require materials, and they may get those from a cleaning material supplier. Maintenance services might require specialist equipment and tools and so forth, and they can in turn get those from their suppliers. Okay. Now, who are the customers of the shopping mall? Well, the customers are really the retailers. They're not you and I as consumers going in and buying things from the shops. They are actually the retailers who are provided a space in the shopping mall in which they can carry out their business. So the first tier customers are the retailers. The retailers sell to you and I. So we are, for the shopping mall, second tier customers. For the retailers, obviously, we're their first tier customers. Okay. And again, we have direct supply going downstream towards the consumers, and information travelling upstream along the supply chain. So, supply chain planning control, what is it? It's concerned with managing the flow of materials and information, as I mentioned earlier, between a string or chain of operations. And these together form the supply network. So, there we are, we have a series of operations again. Supply chain management concerns the flow between a string of operations, as I said there at the bottom. Now, the network can be incredibly complex. We have customers and suppliers in all sorts of configurations, and understanding this complexity is very, very difficult for many organisations. So trying to understand the network is incredibly difficult but very important. Okay, so how do we go about designing a supply chain? Can such a thing be designed? Well, in a sense it is designed. an organisation requires certain services and products in order to carry out its business, and so in order to carry out its business, it needs to procure those services and products. In order to do that, it has to seek the organisations which could provide those products and services. So, what are the considerations they take into account? The first is to support market order winners or qualifiers. So we're looking for suppliers who can support market order winners and qualifiers. Together, we're looking with our suppliers and ourselves as organisations who are working together, we're looking to build barriers to entry from incomers. We want to maintain supply of key materials and key services, and better understand our customers. So a supplier, their business relies on their immediate customer. They may be a first or second tier supplier. Their business requires them understanding and knowing their customer. But the customer may not be the final consumer, but ultimately their business relies on that final consumer. So through the chain, they can better understand their customers and then their consumers. Retain core capabilities. So an organisation might seek to find out what's core to it as a business, what its capabilities are, what is essential to it carrying out its business, what's peripheral, maybe outsourced to suppliers. Also access external capabilities which maybe aren't important on a day-to-day basis but might be suddenly required. So for example, if an organisation is looking to add units of capacity, so a new factory, well, it wouldn't be a builder building a new factory, it would employ a specific architect and builder in order to build the factory on its behalf, which it could then occupy. Take advantage of reduced trade barriers. And finally, the last thing to say is the first step in designing a supply chain is to decide what to make and what to buy. What are we going to do within our organisation? What services are we going to produce? What products are we going to produce? And what's more peripheral to our organisation? What do we buy in? Okay, so an organisation therefore needs to think about what it's going to outsource. That word is important, outsource to its suppliers. So outsourcing is a process of giving another organisation not just the job of doing something on your behalf, but actually the responsibility of putting together the process to deliver that product or service on your behalf. Okay, so not only are you asking them to provide you with a product or service, they have to take responsibility for delivering it in efficiently and effectively. Okay, so that's often mediated via a contractual agreement. So an organisation will ask for a service or product to be provided, and as part of that agreement of specifications of what is to be provided and payment conditions, these will be wrapped up in a form of a contract, a supply agreements and so forth. So the contractual agreement for suppliers of a certain capacity that has previously been carried out in-house. So you may have done something internally, now we're transmitting or transferring that capacity to do that thing internally to a second organisation, another organisation. Okay, ownership, responsibility and decision making has shifted. This can be partly, so the customer might have some involvement in how things are delivered, in timing and so forth, or maybe wholly, might just say, supplier, Mr. Supplier, do everything for me and deliver it according to this contract which we've put together. Okay, offshoring is a specific form of outsourcing, in which companies transfer some or all of their activities to countries outside the country of origin. This is incredibly commonplace nowadays. So essentially what we're talking about here is globalization. Most products, most services are delivered through a network which spans the globe. Also, something which is interesting and a recently developing phenomenon is reshoring, and this is really in response to the speed dimension or speed objective, and dependability objective. So we can have products delivered to us for our activities from Germany or France or China or wherever, and that's fine. They may be able to carry out the manufacturing of products or provision of services more efficiently or effectively than we can. But this results in two things. One is, in particular for products, mass production. So we end up with having large quantities, in other words, large quantities of inventory being delivered to us. And as we've saw in the previous session, inventory is a problem. So organisations are trying to reduce their inventory. Well, one way of doing that is to have faster delivery, more reliable delivery, closer to home. And that is achieved through what some organisations are doing, which is reshoring, bringing those outsourced international activities back to the home country, for the simple reason that they want these products produced more quickly and delivered more consistently and dependably, at the same time reducing inventory involved in the process. Okay, so how do we make or buy or outsource? Why outsource? Well, a number of reasons why organisations look to outsource. Reduce headcount, reduce the number of people employed by the organisation, fewer people, fewer costs, less cost, and less responsibility. Okay, so reduce costs. It also provides flexibility, so we might want something some of the time, but not all the time. So we can like a tap, we can turn on the supply and then turn it off again when we don't need it any longer. So it might provide the organisation with more flexibility. Greater management and financial focus on core activities. So what do we do well, what do we do best, and what is less important to us as an organisation? Don't need to worry about those things. Okay, it might be capacity problems, so we can only produce so much. Building major units of capacity is very difficult and time consuming and costly. A quicker, faster option is to just ask a supplier to provide that capacity. Access to supplier innovation and expertise. So suppliers are often specialists in producing particular services or particular products, and an organisation might seek to tap into their innovation and expertise and reduce time to market. Okay, so there's a logic to outsourcing, a kind of process we can go through, a procedure we can go through in terms of helping us to think about how our organisation chooses to produce services or produce products or outsource those to secondary organisations. We'll start with strategic importance. So right at the beginning of the module, I talked about strategy. Now, the thing to do is think about a particular part of an operation, a micro operation if you like, or a sub operation, which we are thinking about outsourcing. Is it strategically important to us? If it is, we may look to keep it in-house. Maybe it's not, but do we have specialist knowledge of delivering this particular product or service? If we do, we might seek to keep it in-house. If not, is the company's operations performance, our company's operations performance, superior to that which can be provided by suppliers? If yes, then we'll keep it in-house. If no, then we might think about, well, is there a significant operations performance improvement likely if we outsource it? And by operations performance, I'm talking about the 5 key performance indicators or performance objectives of an organisation. If we envisage through outsourcing that we will get an improvement, a significant improvement, then we might seek to outsource it. If not, we keep it in-house. So after going through this process, this structured process of thinking about what we do and what we don't do, what we carry out internally and what we seek to outsource, we can decide in a structured way what activities the organisation focuses on and what it gets suppliers to provide. Okay, so one of the issues is about matching supply chains with market requirements. So remember, the market requirements fluctuate. They fluctuate because of the issue of demand. Now, I talked about this as an organization when I was talking about capacity, inventory, lean synchronization, planning, control. But this actually applies right across the supply network. So the way to think about it is to think about firstly the nature of demand. Are we interested in functional products or innovative products? Are we interested in functional services or innovative services? And then on the other axis we have supply chain objectives. Are we looking to be super efficient or are we looking to be responsive? And in the middle, what you can see is that where we have functional products in terms of demand and we're looking to be responsive, well, there's no match. You're not going to be super responsive if you've got functional products. You just produce lots of them and then deliver them. Similarly with services, you just produce lots of service and deliver it. Okay, so with functional products and services, what we're looking for is efficiency, cost efficiencies, and so our suppliers need to provide that efficiency. With innovative products and services, we're looking to be responsive, to change, to be flexible, to have appropriate inventory levels, which we can use to match unpredictable demand and so forth. So there we are. We have ticks in those two boxes. Broadly speaking, I've talked about in the last session about lean production, and lean production is often applied where we have efficient delivery of functional products. It's very strong in those kind of situations. Where we have innovative products and responsiveness, that's where we have something called agile. So it's agile production is more often found in where that those sort of conditions apply. Okay, some of the implications of efficient as opposed to responsive supply chains. So efficient supply chains, we're looking for predictability in demand, low forecast errors. I remember I talked about forecasting in the last session. Our competitive priorities are cost, quality, and dependability. New service and product introduction is fairly infrequent, and contribution margins are low. We are looking to produce large quantities and at a small margin per unit, and product variety and service variety is very low as well. With responsive supply chains, we have unpredictability, high forecast errors. As a result, the key indicators or key objectives are speed and fast delivery times, also speed, customization, which is innovation, and flexibility, volume flexibility and customization or type flexibility, variety, and absolutely top quality. New products and service introduction is frequent, contribution margins are high. So the result of having what often in responsive supply chains is inventory is that's paid for in terms of high contribution margins. And product variety is very high as well. So let's think about the relationships between different suppliers and customers. So we have business to business and business to customer and customer to customer. So effectively 3 different arrangements, possibly customer to business. Okay, so business to business, very, very commonplace. B2B is often called. And it's the most common, all but the last link in supply chains is business to business. So nearly every organisation is actually has customers who are other organisations, other businesses. I've got e-commerce examples here. So the e-commerce example in this situation is electronic data interchange networks, business information exchanges, and so forth. Business to consumer, obviously very commonplace as well. This is all retailers, catalogues, internet retailers, things like Amazon, those sort of things. Very, very commonplace. What's less common is things like consumer to business. This is very uncommon actually. This is a little bit outdated, this slide. It's starting to become more and more commonplace as consumers are getting into a position where they can start to sell or control the way the service they consume or other consumers might consume is understood by businesses. So things like Airbnb might go there, Uber, those sort of organisations. So the consumer is effectively collaborating with the provider, the organisation like Uber or Airbnb, in order to manage the relationship between one consumer and another consumer. Consumer to businesses, things like trade swaps, eBay, those sort of organisations. Okay, so types of supply relationship. So on the y-axis we have the character of internal operations activity. Do we do anything or nothing? Do we do everything? So Charles Handy talked about the hollowed out organisation where everything is outsourced and all the organisation does is really manage a whole supply network. So some organisations do lots, other organisations do very little and manage the process. And then at the bottom, on the x-axis, we have the type, the nature of the relationship. Is it transactional on the one hand, which is everything is mediated through a contract, sometimes called arm's length. We have many suppliers and we're trading one supplier off against another for lowest cost or more efficiency. Or are we very close? Are our suppliers very close? Do we have just a few suppliers who we focus on who are crucial to our business? Up in the top corner there, where we do everything with very few close suppliers, these are vertically integrated organisations. So the customer owns often large parts or has very, very close relationships with large parts of the supply chain, does most of the production itself. Down in the bottom corner, we have organisations who do nothing and have many transactional relationships. That's kind of virtual spot trading, those sort of activities. Down in the other corner, where organisations do nothing and outsource most of those activities to just a few key suppliers, what we have here is long-term relationships with a kind of virtual arrangement. The reality is most organisations start as vertically integrated operations who then start to outsource parts of their activities which are less important to them. This is traditional supply management and where most organisations shift. Then as they start to develop long-term relationships with some of those suppliers, they shift to what is called partnership supply management. Okay. One of the things I talk about is the natural behaviour of supply chains. This is what's known as the Baldwin effect, or sometimes the Forrester effect, after Forrester, who came up with the subject, or came up with the idea, analysed it, understood it as a phenomenon in the 1960s at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And it's called the Baldwin effect because this kind of behaviour, which you can see in this diagram, is very common. What we end up with is increasing inventories and slowing down of process and increasing lack of efficiency as we go along the supply chain upstream. And this is the way it works. So we have information and delivery delays along the supply chain. And this leads to increasing levels of inventory. So consumers, their demand varies. So retailers keep some stock, keep some inventory in order to hedge or buffer against shifting demand. Now, the way they manage that process is to purchase from wholesalers and require wholesalers to maintain inventory in order to meet their fluctuating needs, and their fluctuating needs as retailer are determined by the fluctuating needs of their consumers. So wholesalers end up holding more inventory. And then manufacturers have to supply wholesalers, they see fluctuating demand, and so they hold yet more inventory. And their suppliers then in turn have to hold greater inventory in order to meet the manufacturer's fluctuating demands. This is compounded by the fact that the signals from the consumer to the retailer to the wholesaler and so forth along the supply chain are time delayed. So the message takes time to be sent, to be received, and then it's sent to the next link in the supply chain. So what we see at the consumer end is perhaps a small fluctuation in demand, but this gets compounded as we go along the supply chain. Okay, causes and consequences. Caused by things like promotional sales. Promotional sales suddenly are there to promote demand, to encourage demand, but suddenly require large quantities at possibly unexpected times. Volume and transportation discounts, economies of scale. Inflated orders. So orders are inflated in order to hedge against possible fluctuations in demand. And poor demand forecasts rather. Also, long cycle times. How long does it take to produce something? If it takes a long time, then demand is received and then we have to wait for days, weeks, possibly months for products or services to be delivered. The consequences are increased safety stock, just in case things demand can't be met. Reduced service levels and such as stockouts and inefficient allocation of resources. Also increased transportation costs because we're moving more and more products from one supplier to their customer. So the bulb effect or the Forrester effect exists in part due to retailers' needs to estimate the mean and variance in demand. The increase in variability is an increasing function of lead time. The more complicated demand models and the forecasting techniques, the greater the effect that we see. Centralized demand information can reduce the bulb effect, but it never gets eliminated. How do organizations cope with it? They try to reduce variability and uncertainty through things like point of sale. So every time you scan something in a supermarket or you place an order on a internet website for a product or a service, then electronic point of sale tills and checkouts are measuring your demand and updating the demand forecast. That on its own is not good enough. Organizations need to share that information along the supply chain. What would help enormously is consistent pricing. However, retailers and other organizations compete against each other partly on price. If we can offer something more cheaply, a similar product more cheaply, then we can beat our competitor and attract more customers. So organizations ideally to have consistent pricing, but organizations don't price consistently. They discount. Reductions in lead times through quicker transfer of order requirements through things like electronic data interchange. Maybe developing alliances, so things like vendor managed inventory, on-site vendor representatives to understand and communicate with their organizations in order to better facilitate supply. Finally, a little bit about supply compression. Okay, so organizations start with schedule changes, and these have an impact to market which is faster. So they can respond to market changes better, and revenues are maximised. Forecasts might be made closer to demand time. So if we can forecast more closely to when the demand actually occurs, we can improve our forecast. If we improve forecasts, we need less safety stock. If we have less safety stock, we reduce our stock holdings and improve our profitability. Defects. If we can identify defects faster, we can improve our quality. reduces our wastage, and that improves profitability. Finally, new products and services. What are they? Can we identify them more quickly? If we can, we have fewer lost sales from delayed launches and less chance of obsolescence because we understand what new products and services are required, and therefore can respond quickly to reduce our inventory levels. If so, in both instances, we can again improve profitability. So the questions I asked at the beginning were: why should an organisation take a supply network perspective? What is involved in managing supply networks? What is involved in designing supply networks? I tackled that as well. What are the different types of supply relationship? I looked at that briefly, and then finally talked about the natural dynamic of a supply network. Okay, quality management next time up.